But good morning. It is really good to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about inconceivable futures. And how do you make inconceivable futures real? So I'm going to start off with an inconceivable future. It started almost exactly 50 years ago this year, but in July, in 1969. In order to talk about the future, the seeds of the future are always somehow in the past. And we talk a little bit about a truly inconceivable future becomes real. July 16th, Apollo 11 takes off from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. You think I would figure out those names. Changed the future. But the interesting thing about this future is not necessarily inevitable. Why did that future, the Apollo 11 future, the NASA future, the space program, why did that become our future? Why did that future persevere? Was that future inevitable? But like any hope again for the future, its seeds were also planted in the past. And in the 1950s and the 60s, there were a number of futures that were in play that were as equally compelling, perhaps, as the space program. I'm going to cover a few of them. One, the counterculture future, a return to nature. The hippie movement has its roots in the 1950s and gets stronger in the 1960s with the hippie movement, Flower Children, a movement where people want to move away from civilization and rebuild the world from the ground up. They were seeking to build a more fair, more equitable society. The ecological city future, architect Paolo Soleri created the massive concept for the arcologies, blending new architecture ideas with the natural environment. He envisioned a structure that would house over 1 million people, but would leave the surrounding environment untouched. He also believed the city could be run for 5 million people entirely on solar power. There's the Buckminster Fuller. This is amazing. The floating city future developed by Buckminster Fuller. He created a floating city for Tokyo Bay. It would have hosted 5,000 residents. He called it Triton. Now, Tokyo Bay didn't build it, but he actually proposed it to the people in Baltimore, and they were going to build it in Chesapeake Bay. It was actually on its way to being built, but there was an argument within the city council. They couldn't make an agreement, and this future never appeared. Then there's also the monorail future, where all the cities of the world would be connected by this sort of single-track monorail. This future was fantastic. It never arrives. Then there was this future, was actually developed, a lot of the engineering for autonomous vehicles were actually developed by Mercedes-Benz in the late 50s and early 60s. They wanted to advance this. I like how they're playing like Monopoly or something in the back seat. Then there's also the plastic future. I love this one. This is the I can clean my house just by putting a hose on it future. I could spend an entire lecture shocking, like insanely improbable futures. This has both improbability, ecological disaster, and sort of sexism all in one. And so what's interesting to me is there's, at the 1950s and 60s, all sorts of futures are always in play. So when we talk about the future, we're really not talking about the future. What we're really talking about when we talk about the future is really the futures. Because at any moment, there are all sorts of futures that are in competition with each other. All the time. Now, there was one future that was incredibly compelling in the 1950s, and that was the beginning of the exploration of space before the creation of NASA. The military, the Air Force in particular, had started to take some very early steps into outer space, including research, low orbit research, and also very early and quite successful forays into early rocket technology. We explored how far we could push the envelope, how far we could go into outer space, the kind of systems that we would need, the kind of environments. What would a weightless environment look like? These are all early experiments that were made in the mid to late 1950s. So outer space was starting to catch a lot of people's imagination, but really the idea of outer space doesn't exist in the military and doesn't exist in science. Where the idea of outer space really lives in the 1950s is science fiction. And science fiction was this sort of ray gun glamour. We could go to the moon, we could go to Saturn, we could go to Venus. I love this. This is fabulous outfits. This is the 1950s view of what tomorrow would look like, which is sort of romantic. It's fun. It's kind of silly. But for the most part, space is the province of comic books, science fiction movies, science fiction TV shows that are basically aimed at children. At least a lot of science fiction television is aimed at children. Science fiction has a great literature, but in popular culture, it's mostly this. Even MGM gets in the act, and they create this amazing film called Forbidden Planet, which is an attempt to make the future look real. in the early 1950s. But for the most part, science fiction 1950s is basically this. So Megyn Kelly being attacked by a monster. So what's interesting is that for the most part, it's space adventure, which is exciting, but it's not real. And for the most part, science fiction lives, or space travel and space sort of lives in our collective imaginations. Until one day in 1957, the most important designed object of the 1950s appears. In October, Sputnik. The Soviet Union shocks the world with the surprise launch of Sputnik 1. Becomes the humanity's first man-made object to go into orbit. And all of a sudden, space adventures change. And all of a sudden, it's a space race. Because we get freaked out. The news, Ross satellite sighted over San Francisco, Ross satellite circling the Earth. There's a signal that you can pick up on your AM radio, and it terrifies everyone. If they can put a satellite over the country, what else can they drop, or what else can they put over the country? What might they be able to drop from a high orbit? So it freaks us out. Then, 1961, just when we thought, we thought the Soviet Union was a post-agrarian culture. The 2 and 3 most important scientific advancements in space travel are made by what we thought was a post-agrarian culture. Yuri Gagarin goes up into outer space. April 12th, 1961. He becomes the first man to journey into outer space. And then, shortly after, the Russians say, okay, we've done that. We're going to put the first, they get the first man in space. They do the first walk in space. And then they say, we're going to the moon. And I only saw these posters about a year ago. Look at these. No one does socialist realism like the Soviets. We're taking the moon. That's where we're going. We're going to win. The revolution will go to the surface of the moon. It continues. The entire cultures, that's where we're going, to the motherland. I love if you didn't get it, I like the rocket ship with the hammer and sickle is subtle. But they claim the moon. They don't put a date on it. But they announce that that's what they're going to do. And they're going to get there first. So all of a sudden, the space race isn't really a race. It's actually, the war is on. 1960, Kennedy gets elected or 1959, Kennedy gets elected. And he says this, at Rice University, he changes and he reframes everything. Many of you are familiar with their speech. I'll just say one paragraph from it. Rice University in 1962, he says this, we set sail in this new sea. We choose the moon. We set sail in this new sea because there's new knowledge to be gained and new rights to be won. They must be won and used for the progress of all people. If the United States occupies a position of preeminence, we can help decide whether this new ocean will be a sea of peace or a terrifying theater of war. We choose the moon, he says. And then he says, in a very real sense, it will not just be one man going to the moon, it will be an entire nation, for all of us must help to put him, of us must help. He has to conjure the nation, and he says all of us will help get him there. So he has to convince a nation who doesn't necessarily want to spend that money that this is a worthy adventure, that it's not about fate, it's about destiny. So what he does, he conjures up an extraordinary American myth. Now, who's watching television in the early 1960s, the late 50s? What's the one thing that America's watching in the early 1960s that we love? We love, well, beside Ed Sullivan. We love Westerns. We love Gunsmoke. We love Wagon Train. We love High Noon. We love Bonanza, which somehow didn't die until the late 1970s. Anyway, we loved these television shows. It was about the frontier. It was about adventure. It was about the West. America looked west. And this is how we defined ourselves. America's great mythology is the look to the West, look to the frontier. Kennedy did something genius. He knows that this is the mythology that we understand, and he reframes it. He takes the myth of America, that we're living, that we should go west, that we live on a frontier. And he says, that's not the frontier. Here's the frontier. So he takes a common mythology and he reframes it for tomorrow. And so he says, he gives us new myths, a new frontier, with new knowledge to be gained, new progress. It will become a sea of peace, not a theater of war, and it's for all of us to go. So he basically reframes the values. It was a war story. It could have been framed as a threat. He could have framed it as a battle against the Soviet Union. He could have continued to see it as a race, and he could have said our focus is to win. But what he does is he does this. He conjures up mythology. Instead of a threat, he turns it into a vision. He frames it against the Soviet Union to a quest for all mankind, and instead of just winning, our mission is to discover extraordinary things. And when we do that, we have to create all sorts of things. We have to create mathematics that didn't exist. We have to create engineering that didn't exist. What's incredible is the Saturn V engine. I don't know if you know this or not. For those of you who are NASA fans, this is a 30, I'm going to read this to you because it always blows my mind. The Saturn V engine, which would get man from the Earth to the moon and back again, is a 36, or actually get out of escape velocity. It's a 36-story, 6.2 million pound, 3-stage liquid fuel, super heavy lift launch rocket. It generated 7.6 million pounds of thrust at launch. It created more power than 85 Hoover Dam engines to get the 3 men into escape velocity and on their way to the moon. We had to create new vehicles to get people to the moon. And the other thing was the entire culture, and I benefited from this growing up, was about making tomorrow arrive sooner. There's a cultural mindset in the space program and in the creative class in America that helped us galvanize all of us to think about tomorrow. Then, of course, July 20th, 1969, the lunar module lands. But here's what's important. When Kennedy says this and we're off the races, we create not just the idea of engineering and technology, but we also do something else. We create images, amazing images about going to the moon. This is the first moon patch that was actually created by the astronauts. It's an image of a piece sort of arriving on the moon. Then, it's not just engineering, we recognize that we have to inspire people's imaginations, so we go to science fiction. NASA doesn't have just great engineers, they have fabulous art directors. We make these people look like heroes. Not only popular heroes, but we conjure up other mythologies, the ideas of explorers, images of Magellan. We frame our heroes as if they're going to not only conquer we're going to go and discover new frontiers. Then, while the engineers and the scientists at NASA are getting us into outer space, the creative class, Hollywood, is getting us into the galaxy, the outer reaches of space. A cheesy TV show, Lost in Space. Every night there was an adventure that got me as a kid into orbit. Then fashion becomes focused on the future. Interior design becomes focused on the future. When I was a kid, I just didn't have to watch it. The idea was that you could actually, this is made by General Foods. What would get you in the future was having sugared tang. My dad could go to the future with his watches. We could watch television on things that look like Sputnik. My dad bought this car. Everything was future facing. Nothing says a kitchen like an astronaut helmet, thanks Mom. My Uncle Tom could smoke his cigarettes on things that look like flying saucers. This is my mom's kettle. Does that make any sense? This is what she cooked casseroles in. Everything is flying. The future's being normalized. This is the equipment that we need for tomorrow. Then I'm watching the Jetsons. Everything is flying. The architecture is flying. Everything flies. McDonald's flies. Our buildings fly. Everything is moving. Everything is spinning. It's as if even when we go to the airport, we're not just going to Missouri, we're going to Saturn. And then, of course, we landed the moon in July 20th of 1969. So we do a couple things. We have engineering, we have equipment we can use, we also have this great mythology. So all of a sudden, Kennedy changed the idea of space war and he turns it into the space age. And we create the space age. We normalize what the future will be. We try to create it around us so we can feel it before it arrives, because we've got to get to the moon by 1969. So in the early 50s, so I'm going to break down how we help create the future and how we do it in our graduate program at the School of Visual Arts, and the one that I teach in. We had the means in the 1950s around rocket technology, but there was no urgency, so we continued to play in science fiction. It was sort of a space adventure. Nothing kicks into real high gear until a threat appears, and the Soviets suddenly appear, and we have to beat Russia to the moon. Then we have a want. We have to beat Russia. So we have the means, we have a want, but we really don't have a philosophy until Kennedy comes along and he reframes the threat. Instead of a theater of war, he reframes it as a theater of peace. It's the highest order value. Designers do none of these things. What designers do is they integrate these things. And designers did this. In order to create the space age, the first thing we had to do is create the idea of the new frontier. We created an aesthetic sensibility that we called Galaxy Moderne. And then we created the equipment for the new frontier. This is how we normalized, integrated all of these different systems. So this is how we teach our class in the School of Visual Arts in terms of creating new possible futures. This is something we call the knot. It's composed of 6 different elements. One is the belief. What's the highest order value you're aiming for? What is the want? What is the marketplace or the political desire that we need to meet? And 3, what are the means? How are we going to do it? What's the technological force of change? Then we connect those. The 3 integrating functions of design are, what's the story? What's the playbook for action? What's the system? What are the tools that we actually touch that help us create the action? And 3, the symbols. How do we create the meaning to normalize the future? I'm going to have Julia talk about a future that she thinks is worth raising, that she's been working with over the last 2 years. Nicely done.
Hi, everybody. My name is Julia Marsh. I'm a recent graduate from the MFA Design program at SVA, where Brian teaches. And I'm going to talk about my graduate thesis for the first time in a public forum with you guys, so hopefully it goes well. So with the guidance of Brian and his business partner, my incredible mentor, Leland Mashmeyer, I developed a future which I believe is worth raising. And it's actually based on something that Brian talked about earlier, the innovation of plastic, a future that we were all sold starting in the mid-century. Plastic cups, plastic tableware, plastic wrappers, plastic hats, plastic knives, plastic forks, sporks, anything could be made out of plastic. And it was treated as a celebration, a vision of a beautiful future. They called it throwaway living. They said it was the future. And now, as we all know, they were right. This is in Guatemala a couple years ago. We now know that from the top of Mount Everest to the deepest oceans, plastic trash is everywhere on Earth. And now we know what's inside of us, too. This is a recent article. Americans eat and inhale 70,000 plastic particles every year. According to The Guardian, that's the equivalent of about the weight of one plastic credit card every week. Now, for the purposes of this conversation, I'm going to be focusing on the largest portion of waste, plastic packaging material. Since the 1950s and the era of throwaway living, the world has produced 146 million metric tons of it. And even more specifically, I'll be focusing on flexible, single-use packaging material, things like wrappers and baggies and pouches, because they're some of the most pervasive polluters on the planet, and they're one of the most difficult materials to replace. Now, before I get too far into this, I want to clarify something. As a graduate student within an MFA design program, I wondered how designers might help solve a problem so large that it affects all life on Earth. I'm not an engineer, I'm not a scientist, but I am a designer. And designers look at emerging complexity and try to find patterns that may be turned to our advantage. So this is where the framework that Brian just talked about comes in handy, the knot. We all want a future where plastic isn't destroying the planet. We all want to minimize the amount of plastic in our ecosystems and in our bodies. Most people don't care how we get there. Some say we should clean it up, and there are many noble efforts happening all over the world to do so. But what do you do with the packaging material that's being made? Many people say that it should be fully recyclable, and that's great, except that we now know that our recycling systems are in crisis. There are many innovations happening with reusable packaging, but that doesn't really address some of the most pervasive plastics. It's unlikely that companies will sell potato chips in a reusable container. So we do need flexible plastic packaging, but we also need it to degrade naturally. So what are the biodegradable alternatives? Well, the most common ones, many of you are probably familiar with these, are derived from corn, potato, sugarcane, and trees, like eucalyptus. And these are all really great efforts. They're not based on petroleum. The issue is that each of them demand costly inputs, including amazing amounts of fresh water, arable land, and time to be produced, which is why most of them cost 2 to 3 times as much as normal plastics. And the other issue is that some of them don't even achieve the goal that they set out to do, which is a concept we call greenwashing. Many of you are probably familiar. Corn bioplastic takes just as long as normal plastic to degrade if it doesn't make it to an industrial composting facility. So if the problem is so clear, why haven't we solved it already? Because plastic really is amazing. To beat plastic, you would have to be thermodynamic, machine compatible, moisture resistant, UV resistant, lightweight, printable, durable, stretchable, scalable. You'd have to have a good look and a nice feel and have a 1-year shelf life and be FDA approved. Oh, and you'd have to be very cheap. So it's not enough that the plant-based alternatives are made from plants. They have to exceed those expectations. They should decompose as quickly as an orange peel. They should restore ecosystems. They should nourish the planet, because otherwise, we're still left with waste that pollutes our systems on land and at sea. Through my research over the past 2 years, I've learned that you don't change the future by eliminating the present. You seek the larger problem and discover new opportunities. What if plastic, this incredibly abundant and destructive material, could actually be benevolent? So this is my belief. My belief is that we should be able to make a cradle-to-cradle plastic that is harmonious with the supply chain at every step. We have an opportunity to reimagine one of the basic building blocks of modern society. Changing this existing paradigm would be a leap towards a thriving and more sustainable future. Now, that may sound lofty, but there is a way. And that way is seaweed. So I'm designing a replacement for single-use plastics that is going to be commercially viable, degrade naturally, and actually improve ecosystems. But why seaweed? Well, seaweed, also known as macroalgae, is a regenerative crop, meaning that it gives much more than it takes. Over the past 2 years, I've had the pleasure of working with biologists, aquaculturists, and seaweed experts like Dr. Michael Graham, who's actually from my hometown, who's been working with seaweed for years. I'm going to play a little clip.
So I think environmentally, it's really hard to say anything negative about an offshore seaweed farm. We don't need to bring nutrients into the system the same way you would have to do with land-based agriculture. We also have no fresh water. These are seaweeds, right? When you're bringing in the nutrients, the seawater is already coming with it. That allows the seaweed to basically grow on its own, utilizing those resources, very limited input. All there is a little bit of human activity. My deep understanding of seaweed suggests to me that you can do whatever you want with it, and it's pretty much going to be a good thing.
So just to reiterate on Dr. Graham's point, unlike corn, potato, sugarcane, and eucalyptus, seaweed doesn't need any water. It doesn't need any land. Sorry, it doesn't need any fresh water. It doesn't need any fertilizer or feeding or pesticides. And this is the real kicker. Compared to corn, potato, sugarcane, or eucalyptus, seaweed takes 1 month to grow a full crop. It grows 20 to 30 times faster than traditional crops. Corn, sugarcane, potato, and eucalyptus can't do what seaweed does, which is why scientists, researchers, and companies all over the world are starting to look at seaweed as a source material for bioplastic, including myself. So over the past 2 years, I've been researching and developing my own seaweed-based bioplastic. Now, as I mentioned, I'm a designer, not a scientist. I called up a friend of mine who's a material scientist, and together in the kitchen, we prototyped these sheets of bioplastic made from seaweed. We used a red variety of seaweed, and already you can see without professional equipment or funding, we were able to make a material that looks and feels a lot like plastic. This is our most recent prototype. And now we're exploring relationships with innovation partners. A great one I've already connected with is called Checkerspot, and they're an innovation lab that works with algae and bioplastics. I'm going to play a little clip from their lab.
Finding an alternative to plastic is literally an all-hands-on-deck moment.
Oh, sorry. Once again.
Finding an alternative to plastic is literally an all-hands-on-deck moment for us as scientists and as a planet. When you're thinking about bioplastics, you have to think about where does the input material come from? Algae is an incredible, abundant, ancient resource. It is prolific, it grows quickly. It used to be buying green meant you were giving up something on performance. And I think that those days are over.
So just to leap off that point, if you want to really truly beat plastics, you have to have a performance-first approach to engineering. So I've already developed this multi-layer laminate where each layer of seaweed is treated in a different way. You have a printed layer, a metallized layer that keeps out moisture and is puncture resistant. You have your primary structure and then a heat sealable layer. And the idea, the goal, is that in the end, we will produce a material that will appear as though nothing has changed, when in truth, everything has changed. The material will be intrinsically marine safe, rapidly compostable, carbon negative, non-toxic, the list goes on. And soon, I hope that everyday items like these could be replaced with seaweed packaging. And so we have our means. It really is seaweed, a highly abundant, versatile material which is inexpensive, grows quickly, and requires minimal input. My vision of tomorrow is a world driven by what we would call biofuturism, a world where we create infrastructure that supports all life, not just human life. And already we're able to start binding this future together with a foundational technology, a high-performing, seaweed-based packaging material that regenerates ecosystems rather than destroying them. But I haven't even told you the best part yet. This is where it gets really exciting. Seaweed isn't just a raw material or a unique source material. I traveled to Indonesia last summer to visit some of the world's oldest seaweed farms. There, I learned that seaweed is a hard worker in a number of ways. Seaweed purifies ocean water, combats acidification, cleans the air, creates ecosystems for hundreds of species to live in, increases biodiversity, and captures enormous amounts of carbon from the atmosphere. Now, to give you a sense of seaweed's power, last year, global carbon emissions reached an all-time high of 37 billion metric tons. Here's one provocation from researchers at the University of South Pacific, the Intergovernmental Organization Research University. They believe that if we covered just 6% of the world's oceans with seaweed farms, we'd capture that entire amount of carbon in less than a year. In theory. Now, what would you do with all that seaweed once it's been grown? It's already being used as a biofuel, and as a light source, and as a heat source. It's very nutritious. You can feed it to people, of course, and to sheep, and to cows. This is a fun fact. It actually reduces their methane output by 99%. And you can turn it into a bioplastic. So there's not just economic benefit for investing in seaweed cultivation, there's enormous environmental benefit, enormous. In military terms, they would call seaweed a force multiplier. Very minimal input, maximal output. We need a higher order, something that learns from nature, something that is benevolent, imaginative, and generous. A force multiplier. So this becomes our story. A material that gives back much more than it takes. Now, I know what you're all thinking. Why hasn't this happened before? If seaweed is so magical, why hasn't this happened before? And there are many answers to this question. One is that the current global economic and development model does not account for natural capital and does not consider the ecosystem services provided by biodiversity as a fundamental part of the economic system. So that's a problem. Plastics are most commonly produced from petroleum because the model shows that they're cheaper. But what if the model showed total cost? Pollution, threatened marine life, illness, waste piling in landfills, the cost of recycling. Truly holistic models would show that petroleum is way more costly and way less value creating. What if instead the value created was taken into account? Seaweed would blow petroleum-based products out of the water. And another answer ties back to Brian's talk, the mythology of the West. Over the past century, American industries have sought replacements for plastics. They've looked, as Americans always have, to the West, the land. That's why we see corn and potatoes. 200 years of tradition have developed an economy that relies on them. The government subsidizes them. It doesn't mean that they're the best. Let's move further west, because then you'll see the ocean, a frontier that's 95% unexplored. In the same way that Kennedy opened up a new frontier and used the space age to unite us, entirely changing how we feel about technology, I believe that packaging that regenerates the planet, that regenerates the Earth, could align the commercial world with the natural one. Now, this may sound inconceivable, but it's not. Now, the final binding piece, the biological systems that we build will be beautifully crafted. We need beautiful symbols to engage with people's imaginations. Now, marine imagination, as we're calling it right now, a term which encompasses biomimicry and mythology, paints a picture of what this world will look like. We need a marine imagination because otherwise people will assume that our source material looks like this. Let's be honest, seaweed has a reputation for being kind of gross. It's filled with gnats, maybe it piles up on beaches, maybe it smells bad. You wouldn't assume that this is a material full of value. I mean, it's called a weed. We need to change that. We need people to see seaweed the way that I do. It's beautiful and fluid and gorgeous. It dances, it sways. It's an overlooked answer. And then your imagination opens up. Seaweed becomes a new building block with unlimited potential, a new kind of material. Imagine a lab that's filled with this kind of thinking. What I hope is that we inspire people. Seaweed is elegant. So is biology. They're beautiful and they're vibrant. So we fill this world with work that's inspired by the natural world, the scientific world, the art world. And the lines between these different disciplines start to be blurred. And all this research and thinking has been poured into something real, my graduate thesis, which I've named Sway. Sway represents what happens in the ocean, of course, the tide moving in and out. We need that same kind of presence in negotiating the future with everyone. We need to sway people to this point of view. We need to sway people into the future. We can't demand it of them. And these are the action items I've laid out. First, of course, we're developing this material. To make this future real, we need to make a high-performance material made from seaweed. Second, we're advancing the seaweed story. We need to share stories and symbols in order to support the Western agroeconomy of seaweed. And then third, and most important, I'm unifying a diverse network of experts in biology, material science, packaging, sustainability, aquaculture, design, and beyond to create really practical solutions for plastic pollution. In fact, we're already engaging with packaged goods companies and retailers who are providing significant insight and escalation to our efforts. And just to wrap things up, I'm deeply motivated by this future. It's an absolute honor to be here. I'm sure many of you have more knowledge in many of the things I've been discussing today than I do. I would love to hear your insight and wisdom if you're excited about it as well. And thank you so much for your time.
So to quickly wrap it up, so the futures were we could put a man on the moon, we could replace plastic with regenerative packaging. There are all sorts of futures that are looming. There are all sorts of futures we can create. There are really important ones we have to take advantage of. But there's one thing that we do know about the futures, and here's what's hard about them, is the futures that are most important to us, the futures that have most promise, the futures that are most exciting, the ones that we really should be investing in. Here's what's hard about them, is that any future worth raising will seem inconceivable in the present. And that's true of any future, whether that's going to the moon or in a few years from now, eating Nature Valley bars, which, by the way, are delicious. I've been having them all day, or all week. To have those things that we look at it, and there's a symbol, and it says that this packaging is made out of seaweed. It's not something we throw away. You actually take it, you can throw it in the earth, it actually becomes a nutrient. So inconceivable is what we're going to have to create. And our hope is in the work that we're doing, both at the School of Visual Arts and my own practice, that inconceivable futures are worth investing in. Thank you very much. Now, this is the part where we ask questions. And this is the part where we wait for 30. Oh, that was fast.
Who are your major producers, companies that produce plastic? And have they at all looked at the, quote, economic viability of seaweed? Because ideally, if we took a look and said, if the cost could be produced at the same basis, they would do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think almost every major plastic producer has a sustainability effort, and most of those are focused on either reducing the amount of packaging material that's wrapping the products, or they're focused on making them hyper-recyclable. A lot of the issue, which is kind of nuanced, is that these multi-layer laminates are bonded together with adhesives that are really hard to recycle. To my knowledge, they have not looked at seaweed, but they're, how do I do that?
How do you take this idea and get into the producers and say, guys, this is the best thing to do. It helps save the planet, do it.
Yeah.
It's purely a cost. I'm sure it's just cost.
Yeah, yeah. First it comes with science. First it comes with making sure that the material we're developing is absolutely compatible with existing equipment. We're not trying to overhaul the entire system, we're just trying to change the material. And then it also starts with talking with really big, influential consumer packaged goods companies who can really sway and say, this is a mandate. This is part of our sustainability initiative. We're going to have regenerative packaging. And then it trickles down from there. I think it starts within that machine.
Yes. Miss.
That's a great story. Do you have a financial model?
I do, yeah. I thought an ideas festival might not be the place to share it.
Right. No, I understand that. And did, because just partnering with one of those companies on that model, are you close to getting to that step?
Am I able to disclose that?
Well, not
We can talk about that later.
Yeah.
Not who it is, but are you doing
Conversations are happening.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah, thank
It's
you.
a great idea.
Thank you.
Oh, you have a mic, but you're not going to ask a question. Okay. Is there any other question? Yes.
You showed some great pictures of single-use packaging and the damage that's being done to our environment. Did you look at other ways, waste energy as an example of what do we do with everything that's being produced right now? And is that a viable
Absolutely.
solution?
Yeah. I actually attended a talk with the wonderful Paolo Antonelli yesterday, and they shared some great examples of how plastic could conceivably be reused indefinitely, that this would be the source material for future innovation. So there's all sorts of kinds of things being made, furniture, technological appliances, all sorts of things, great solutions for reusing the plastic that already exists. Paved roads are happening. So there's plenty of innovation there, but not for flexible plastic packaging, which is my interest. Yeah.
Yes. I'll just say yes. I'll just point.
A question for Brian.
No,
A question.
important.
I assume seaweed doesn't become packaging by magic, but requires processing. The question is, are the chemicals used in processing in short supply, harmful to the earth, petrochemical based, and so forth?
Yeah, fabulous question. Certainly not petrochemical based, but that actually is what I'm exploring right now, making sure that the supply chain from top to bottom is fully sustainable and conscious of those inputs, yeah.
Hi, I'm Ann Drake. I'm a supply chain executive.
Oh, fabulous.
Just coming off of the first annual Ocean Plastics Leadership Summit in the Pacific Gyre. Were you invited to that?
No, I'm fresh out of grad school. This is a brand new thing.
Well,
Yeah.
I can introduce you to people all over the world representing all aspects of the supply chain. And
Please,
it's-
bravo. Please, yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to compliment you, especially because when you started your talk, you said, I'm not a scientist, I'm not an engineer, and I'm very proud that the design culture, you have come from the design culture. And I think because you are able to see the big picture of all the little pieces that need to come together. And I'm just really proud of you. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
I think we'll take one more question and we'll wrap it up. Unless there's not any other question, then we're going. There's one over here, and we'll call it a morning.
Thank you very much for your talk. What are the actual mechanics of harvesting seaweed, and how much seaweed has to be harvested to make a meaningful impact or to actually replace plastics?
I'm so glad you asked that
And how-
question.
and
Yeah,
Secondly,
yeah.
following up on that, what is the time period? Like, if you could start today, how do you roll it out?
Yeah, I love that question. Any opportunity to talk about seaweed, I will take. If anyone wants to just gossip about seaweed after this. So another great thing about seaweed is that in addition to growing really rapidly, there's really high volume for the amount of space given. So in a 20-acre, the same equivalent hectare space of growing corn, for instance, you would produce 21 dry hectares of raw material that could be used, right? In that same amount of space, you would produce 5 times as much seaweed. So that you need much less space to produce much more seaweed at a much more rapid pace. And then when you're harvesting seaweed, you're not actually taking the full crop, you're just giving it a haircut. So the biodiversity that I talked about remains intact. And then, what was the last part of the question?
How much seaweed, I mean, those are great numbers and metrics, but how do you envision, where are these farms going to be, and then how do you harvest it to get it to the point where it's actually materially replacing petrochemical plastics?
Okay, yeah, so the major seaweed farms right now are based, in North America, are based in Chile, in Alaska, and then further down south in South America, there's a tremendous amount of seaweed growing off the coast of Chile. And the idea is that we would be able to cover these coastlines in seaweed farms. And it'll take time because there's a lot of regulation around that. But ideally, we're sourcing from either North America or South America. The processing component is pretty nuanced, but there's basically a 2-step extraction process. And I don't know that I can totally answer your question, as I'm definitely not the scientist here. But it'll take about a year for us. We expect to have a material that can perform in the same way that plastic does. Yeah.
So that's the last question. I wanted to thank, one more.
What is your funding source?
We're just starting to look into that. Yeah, I just graduated from college. If anyone would like to talk to me, if anyone has wisdom or insight, I'm certainly not asking for anything, but if anyone has wisdom, I would love to hear that.
There's some early conversations that look really promising, but we're at the very early phases of this. So all the questions that you guys are asking are crucial. The graduate program that we create is in a design program at the School of Visual Arts in New York. We have our students create new products and services and businesses. It's sort of, imagine a junior achievement meets design. And so what we do for 2 years, we have the students examine and interrogate a puzzle, and we get from the point where the thesis is viable. And we work with VC folks in New York and some really remarkable folks. In the case of Julia, we work with scientists and biologists and marine biologists. We're at a point now where those conversations are starting to happen. But there's anyone who has far more expertise or insight into this who might be fascinated or curious about this conversation. Julia will be eager to hear all of it. So it would be great if you're curious, and thank you for the invitation to participate in that Ocean Plastics Forum. Yeah. That would be remarkable. So if there are no questions, I'll ask one more because I'll ask one more because I'm codependent. Okay.
You mentioned that this was good for flexible packaging. What about the hard plastics? How can that be used in that?
Absolutely, and I actually showed a slide, and I'd love to spend more time talking about it in the future. There are really, really great efforts happening with algae and seaweed developing rigid plastics. The reason that I'm interested in flexible plastic packaging is it's one of the most difficult problems to solve. Yeah.
It really sounds fantastic. Do you know the implications for the ecosystems of the oceans if that were produced at a larger scale?
Yeah, really delicate balance. That's why I've brought aquaculturists and seaweed biologists into the fold, because if there is a balance that needs to be struck, and I don't want to disrupt that balance. I'm keeping a lot of people who care very much about the ocean in this conversation. It's crucial. Yeah.
So thank you very much for coming, everyone. Really great weekend.